Hello and welcome everyone to the third episode of the short series Staging Ancient Greek Theatre Then and Now, hosted here at UCL in occasion of UCL's annual classical play, which this year will be Euripides Electra, running from the 9th to the 11th of February 2022 at the Bloomsbury Theatre in London. More information on tickets, pre-show talks, as well as videos, essays, and workshops about the play can be found on our website, www.ucl.ac.uk/classics-classical play. I'm the director of this year's play, Zoe Morris, and I am joined today by Assistant Director Lucy Rudderman, and we have the pleasure of having with us two special guests who will be interviewed on this week's episode on translation, adaptation, and Greek tragedy, then and now. Professor Fiona McIntosh, Professor of Classical Reception at the University of Oxford and Director of the APGRD, the Archive of Performances of Greek and Roman Drama, Dr. Giovanna Di Martino, Leventis Research Fellow in Ancient Greek Literature, and our academic advisor for the classical play. And without further ado, I'll just jump into our first question. We see a lot of similar interpretative processes at work in the act of translating a theatrical text and in staging one. Should we think of performance of a Greek tragedy as part of the process of translating and adapting it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I think that some scholars would even argue that theatre is a form of translation, and that's quite interesting in itself. And theatre can also be thought of as a form of adaptation, which is often linked with translation as a practice in the theatre, in the theatrical process. And translation actually can be productively understood as entailing a process of resignification that is not just limited to words, it's not just limited to languages, but invests everything else in the theatrical process, from words to visual. So a prop in the text, for example, gets translated into a physical object on the stage. And if you think of the tokens that are so important in the recognition scene in Euripides' Electra, for example, the lock of hair, the footprints, the cloak, the scar, these are all things that get translated across onto the stage and are part of the translation process of putting on Euripides' Electra. If you think of, what happens when the recognition scene finally happens, been waiting long enough for them to actually recognize each other, and they finally seem to be able to recognize each other, and they finally embrace. So what that means on the stage, that's another form of translation. So why is that? And why is that sort of a peculiarity of theatre? Because theatre has multiple languages. Doesn't have just the language of words. Doesn't have just the language of the text, the dramatic text that is being put on, but also has the gesture, right? So which has been often recognised as one of the core elements of the language of theatre, famously by the French director Anthony Artaud in Theatre and its Double, which was published back in 1936. So how do we translate that gesture onto the stage, which in itself is to begin with in the text understood in a wider sense. And if I'm allowed to make a little parenthesis on the history of the term of translation, especially in the theatrical realm, I think it's important to note that it's especially as a result of the performative turn which took place in 1960s, and practically what it meant was a pervasive influence of the theatrical experience of performance onto our understanding of human behavior, as performative, as performance. That translation was then itself as a concept reconceived as a metaphor for the performance itself, for the performance process itself. So translation became a synonym of performance, especially in the theatrical process. Now, if you think about it, this has led to some pros and cons, right? So the main cons being that, if translation is so ubiquitous, then it loses its specificity. But the most positive, I think, outcome of coming from this performative turn in the 60s is that the centrality of performance made us understand theatre translation as much more than just a translation or a transaction from one linguistic system to another. And in fact, it has made us think of translation as a translation for the stage, translation in the theatrical process as involving the multiple languages, the incorporating the multimediality of the theatrical event and its multiple signs. So again, going back to that gesture of the translation text or of the translation in the theatrical process. So as a consequence, since I think especially in the 1980s, since the 1980s and onwards, there has been or there have been collaborations between the translator and the director, or the translator and the dramaturg. We spoke about dramaturgy a couple of episodes ago, and I think these collaborations have been very much important in sort of rethinking the role of the translator for the stage, on the stage, and on the page as well. I know we'll get to that later. So I think absolutely it's a very interesting way of thinking of translation as actually a concept that involves or entails the whole of the theatre, of the theatrical process.
That really is so interesting, and there's so much there to think about, and that does come up. I mean, what you were saying towards the end there reminds me there's this real trend of sort of presenting it not as a translation or an adaptation, but as a version, in a new version by such and such. And I think that's such an interesting attempt to try and contain or express all of that, because I think sort of every performance is a new version, right?
Yeah. I mean, there are also, issues of or questions of marketing, right? So how much does marketing play a role in how you present yourself or present your translation? So do you want Euripides to be part of that big title, or especially when you're publishing a translation, or when you're putting on a translation, you're putting on a translation for the stage, do you want Euripides to be part of the title? Because that sells really well, right? So there's multiple layers in this idea of the variety of names that we can find on a program, right? A translation by, or a version by, or etc., an adaptation by, etc., etc.
Yeah, can I just add that there's a kind of irony, isn't there, that today we finally understand the translation process, and I think people in theatre often talk about it as a process from kind of text to body. I also like to think there's another step, and I know you, Giovanna, definitely think that, and that is the translation to the audience, because the audience are part of that kind of process. So we understand the translation process, but as you say, we seem even more than ever to need an author or the marketing department does, and that is slightly strange, and in some ways suggests almost that we're back in a world of the theatre equals a text, which, as you, Giovanna, said, at least from the 60s anyway, we haven't been quite so hung up about.
Kind of brings us on to maybe our next question about the text and the popularity of text, is that Euripides Electra is not one of the most popular or frequently staged Greek tragedies. Why do you think that that's the case, and what, makes some of these plays more appealing than others, both on the page and on the stage?
Shall I have a go at that one, Giovanna? I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm really excited that this is the Euripidean version. It's Euripides' Electra, because we so rarely see it. And I think it's very important to think at what times in kind of Western theatre history has Euripides' Electra had any kind of profile. And I think it's true to say that the only time it did was in the early modern period. And partly because Euripides had considerable status at the time. In fact, Euripidean tragic figures were often emblems of tragedy and the way people understood tragedy at the time. But by the definitely by the 17th century, Euripides gets eclipsed by Sophocles, and that's particularly true of the Electra. And in a very early version of Aristotle's Poetics, a commentary and translation into French by someone called André Dacier towards the end of the 17th century, one of those translations to show what tragedy really looked like that was into French was the Sophocles Electra. And so throughout the 18th century, if you look for Euripides' Electra, you can't find it anywhere, except in very, very different guises, usually called Orestes, or bits of it inside something called Orestes. But for the most part, from now on, if you think Electra, you think Sophocles. And that remains the case right into the 20th century, even when people, and at the beginning of the 20th century, in the English language, in the English speaking world, at least, thanks to Gilbert Murray, people really rediscovered Euripides, and he was sort of box office draw in the first part of the 20th century, sometimes even the Electra, but not really the main play. And I think we have to say, why did Sophocles' version dominate? Well, in part because it has a very different tone, and I'm sure those of you working on the play know exactly what I'm going to say, and that is Sophocles became the tragic playwright par excellence, and in many ways in the history of Western thinking around tragedy, it was Sophocles and Shakespeare who were the exemplar of tragedy, and Euripides was always put into this category as the kind of problems, the tragic mode that somehow often looks as though it was tipping into something else, tragicomedy. It didn't have, a tragic ending necessarily. It might have a tragicomic ending, look more like an 18th century opera where, the gods come down and solve all the problems. So Euripides' play, his version, and maybe we'll go on to think about how and in what particular ways it is so different from other tragedies, not least if you think of tragedy as being something high, in dealing with only kingly peoples. Here you open a play and you've got a farmer who has known only the countryside, his land. He's never been to court. He's not, he doesn't know what happens at the metropolitan center. And that is maybe what we, as those who more recently, again after the 60s, we like the idea of tragedy not being tragedy, famously, as Arthur Miller said, of the common man, the ordinary person. And in some ways, Euripides, recognized, of course, by his contemporaries as such, and often criticized by his contemporaries, was doing something different with tragic form. And there's a very good case for saying this is much more interesting to us today because it doesn't look like many Sophoclean tragedies or traditional tragedy. It's doing something different.
I remember reading somewhere that even in the ancient world, whether this is true or not, I don't know, that Socrates watched Euripides' lecture and thought it was immoral. I think he might have walked out. I don't know whether this is true or not, but I wonder if even then, the ideas that were being proposed were unpopular already, and that continued on to today.
I think you're absolutely right, because if you look at Aristophanes' Frogs, where Euripides finds himself in a head-to-head contest with Aeschylus. Significantly, Sophocles is not there, and in some ways he's already been acknowledged, yes, as the sort of perfect tragedian. But yes, Euripides is criticised and lampooned, and so even as you say, in antiquity, though, both the whole of the Euripidean kind of corpus, but particularly certain plays, were eccentric and problematic.
But that's what's made it fun for us to stage, because on the first reading of it, I remember our first read through with the cast, everybody sort of went, oh, this is actually quite funny. And everyone was laughing, going, oh, I was expecting, Greek tragedy, everyone comes on covered in blood and screams, misery, or whatever. But they were like, no, this is funny.
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the features that I understand you have been working on quite extensively is humour, right? So humour, the humour in the language that was used in the language of the play, and so it's I think it has been fun for you to work with that in putting on the play.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. We've massively played with that. And I think even my first reading of the text, what was so special about it is that the humor in the first half, I guess, made the second half contrast so nicely. And I thought it was even more the build up to that, and the fact that, they tickle you and then they punch you. That whole dynamic was so powerful. And I think especially for modern audiences that aren't used to that, to kind of the sustaining, the natural build-up of tragedy, having a bit of comedy in the beginning makes the ending digestible and almost more powerful.
And also, that's a really interesting point, Zoe, because for so long, people who talk about Shakespeare are absolutely aware that the subplots are often very funny in the tragedies, and talked about how important those kind of that contrast is in contributing to, in enhancing, the effect or the impact of the tragedy. But commentators on Greek tragedy rarely thought that, or could not see, as you say, that actually cumulatively this is another way of achieving precisely the effect that you're saying in the read through you very early on began to realize was the power of the tragedy in this Euripidean version.
So just speaking of, read throughs, moving on to trying to stage it, on this question of translation, so should a translation for the stage differ at all from a translation for the page?
Yeah, I think I would probably start with a more general question, which is, what is the nature of the text that we are translating, and what kind of translation do we want to produce? Because there's always an intention when we translate. So the translation's invisibility, as it were, doesn't actually exist. So there's always an intentional or an intention behind a translation. And I think, why do I ask the first question? What is the text that we have in front of us that we are about to translate, or that we are translating, or that we are putting on? Because it's a dramatic text. Therefore, it's in its nature to be performed. So it is it's not irrelevant that the nature of the text that Greek tragedy, for example, presents is a dramatic one. Is one that requires, in the end, as a result, the stage. So in this sense, I think translation for the page and translation for the stage are not very different, in fact, because they both take into account the very nature of these texts. And especially, again, going back to the history of translation, especially since the 1960s and since the rediscovery, as it were, of these texts as play texts, really, as texts that were capable of being really powerful on the stage, then there has been a surge in translation of translations of Greek tragedy with the purpose of translating them for the stage, with the purpose of performing them on the stage. And some of the book editions that have been created for Greek tragedy are testify to this surging interest of translating Greek tragedy for the stage, even when the translation is actually on the page. And if I can make an example, there's this professor of classics, this American professor of classics, University of Texas, in 1961. He talked about, so Professor Khan Ross, he talked about in Craft and Context of Translation, he talked about translation of Greek drama as needing total recreation. Now, this was a book that was sort of pioneering especially in the field of translation and the classics. And then he ended up doing quite a lot on translation and the classics. And why am I saying this? Because I think this total recreation is, yes, very needed when translating Greek tragedy, because it doesn't just involve, as we were talking about before, it doesn't just involve languages, but involves involves theatrical conventions, a set of theatrical conventions, which are just as important as the literary ones. And so when we talk about translation for the stage and translation for the page of a Greek tragedy, we need to bear this in mind, even if our end game is the page and not the stage. Now, this obviously has led to some concerns about, especially within the field of classics and thirds, about, but what about accuracy? What about fidelity? What does this total recreation actually mean? And discrepancies or questions about, then should this be called an adaptation rather than a translation? And we go back to this variety of terms that have been used to define translation for the stage and to define especially translation of Greek drama for the stage. So what do we make of all this? Is adaptation actually another form of translation? And where are the boundaries between translation and adaptation, as they both involve in some ways the same sort of process? So I think in this sense, it's interesting to look at the history of the term, because it gives you an idea of how, in fact, the kind of problems that you pose yourself as a translator of the page, or as a translator for the page, are the same ones that you ask yourself when you're translating for the stage. So there are really not many differences between the two. And if we think about the nature of the text itself, so the nature of these originals, the original tragedies that are often sort of, or have often been held as these kind of sacred texts, which should not be touched and should not be adapted. To go back to this idea of or this discourse of fidelity and accuracy that has been haunting the discipline of classics for a long time. If we think of the text as not something fixed to begin with, as they were, and we know this because we know that the papyri actually contained these texts. They show a continuous text with it all in capital letters. There's no there are no stage directions. There's no identification of the speaker. So these texts actually to begin with were very much texts that were meant to aid the memory of someone who had already seen the play on the stage. So, and then the idea that, as I often and Zoe has I think heard this before a number of times, but the idea that Lycurgus in 330 BCE orders the drawing up of these texts into official copies. Now, almost a century later, to some of these texts, and he orders the drawing up of some of Aeschylus's, Euripides', and Sophocles' plays to be held in the state archives. That means that these texts to begin with were very adaptable and had been adapted and reperformed for more than a century already in 330 BCE, and that testifies to the idea that the original, it's an open text. It's a text that requires to be adapted.
I can agree with you more. And actually, and what you say about antiquity is really important to hold on to, very important. And some people even have said we need to think again about, how texts were made, in the early modern period, and as different people, a bit more like the Hollywood script, and how that's put together, contributing at different stages in the process. Again, this idea of getting away from one author and therefore one kind of definitive text. But I think it is quite important to, if you look at the history of translation for the modern stage, that really until 1833 in the English speaking world, when there was something called the Dramatic Copyright Act, until that time, there was really no such thing as theatre translation, because everything, anything that calls itself, and Giovanna is an expert on this well beyond English as well, something that calls itself a translation, we would not consider it to be so. It is all translation was about adaptation and, of course, above all, improvement, or what we would call adaptation for the moment, in which something is being performed. So there is only a short window, and after, when people wanted to own a text, and if they were dead, all the better, because you could own it as the translator and pretend it was yours, as people often did. And somehow, when we think about translation, and that goes back to really our first answer, we just have to get away from this idea that so whilst, as you say, everyone who's writing a translation to be read needs to think of the same processes that someone who's writing for the stage, the major difference, I suppose, is that the person translating for the stage has to be even less keen to hold on to that text, because they know that as soon as it goes into the rehearsal room, it's going to change, and they can't, be jealous about their words. The only thing is, you could, if it's going to be published, and it's, even if the end product is designed for theatre performance, it will not be changed unless it's already been so by your editor. It'll be fixed on a page, whereas people today translating, of course, never have that experience. And I think it was Tom Stoppard who went through that experience in a number of contexts, said you have to think of it as a transcript. It, not only because there's so many other layers, but because it is only a very kind of provisional text.
That sort of brings us on to our next question, which is there a point of no return where you can no longer call a version or performance of a text a translation? So could we take Electra so far that it ceases to be Euripides' Electra, and is that even a meaningful way to think about these things?
I think it's quite an exciting prospect, and I think we may begin by thinking that we would definitely know when it wasn't Euripides' Electra, and And then we may even say we would definitely know when it stopped being an Electra. But I am pretty confident that we would all say that that becomes quite a difficult no. And so I suppose what I'm trying to say is that we think we could draw a line and say it stopped now being Euripides' play. But I think we are theoretically more confident in that than if we were in practice doing that. And especially, and I'm sure you two, working very, very closely with the script would probably say that the more you get to know the script. And the reason I say that is because I think we are, and Giovanna's very much said it, translation is not a two-way process. It's not moving from one text to another. There are always so many other intertexts, other sources at play. And sometimes those sources have apparently very little correspondence with something we call, the urtext, the original kind of text. But other times, because they've been retold time and again, they become intimately connected with it, albeit in quite complicated and very entangled kind of ways. So and I say this from experience because when many years ago, as you said, Zoe, I'm director of something called the Archive of Performances of Greek and Roman Drama, and we have a very large database of what modern performances of plays inspired by Greek originals, ancient Greek original tragedies and comedies. And in the early days, we were quite, we were purists. We were sort of measuring ruler almost to see, whether this could be included or not. And in the end, this was, how long is a piece of string? This is a really pointless exercise. And much more important, as in so many things, is to think as widely as we can. So for me, I would think I know where it stops being Euripides, but I would probably on reflection say I was wrong.
Yeah, if I can add to that just a quick note, which is going back to this idea of the original with inverted commas as basically a concept, a construct more than something that actually existed. I think it's always useful to come back to this to this idea of the original, of having a chorality of voices behind the original. I found Derrida, the philosopher Derrida, very interesting in this respect, when he talks about the original as being actually non-existent because there's an originary complication of the origin. So there's always the text is always inhabited by something else or someone else. So this chorality of authors in the original and thus in the translation, which only reveals the very nature of the original, I always found really interesting to work with.
That's such an interesting point. And I think adding to our conversation about dramaturgy and this question in the dramaturgical space, I think Estelle said something so interesting about how we don't necessarily have the resources to translate the original intention. And sometimes it feels like that would be, like, if that is an impossible task, then why not adapt in the way that we can? And I guess it's just the question of whether our translations should be trying to retrieve and not just retell, I guess.
I think the important thing from my perspective, I don't know how heretical it sounds, is that I think you decide what do you want to do. And I suppose today you could say that you have, and Giovanna's given you one very good defense, if you like, of doing what might be considered, something unorthodox. You invoke Derrida, but you can invoke lots of other people as well. And so I think it's you decide what you want to do. And I think, as you say, Estelle had said, that how can we ever recover original intention? Yeah, it's and original intention would definitely not work for your audience in 2022 in Bloomsbury Theatre in London. And you talk to people who are staging comedy, they know that all the time, don't they? And so why should it be so much different with tragedy? And the best experiences I've had in the theatre watching a Greek tragedy have often been taking completely different routes, and I still think that the best experience I ever had was outside in Edinburgh at the festival way back in the 80s, in the rain, watching a Japanese production of Euripides' Medea. That wasn't how it looked, but it to me had sort of, well, it opened up other possibilities in Euripides' play, but it also made me also think of maybe kind of analogues, other ways of thinking about how ancient performance might have looked as well. So for me, it's a very kind of liberating thing. You're in the best position as directors, and I don't think you have to justify yourself in the way that you would have done, wouldn't you, Giovanna? Some years ago, you would have had someone who would come and reprimand you because your chorus weren't wearing white sheets.
Yeah,
And hadn't declaimed, as only good Greek choruses did. And they moved around too much, or they did something that looked like, they'd been to Zumba classes or something.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right, and I think just to go back to a more sort of because I've been very unorthodox as you said, but I think translation we also need to remember that translation is an act of understanding. So it's first and foremost an act of understanding the text. So it's the encounter between you and the text that creates what then gets onto the stage or the page. So in that sense, it's a liberating process because you are part of the equation, whether you like it or not, but you are part of it.
That's wonderful. It's very uplifting, actually. Shall we go on to our final question? Because we've talked a little bit about the chorus. Just that the choral odes are some of the most interesting, but also the most obscure aspects of certainly of this play, and I think of most Greek tragedy. So how do you go about translating, in the broadest sense of the word, how do you go about translating choral odes?
As I'm sure you're finding, it's always the biggest challenge, isn't it? And it's, sometimes that challenge might come because the words you're using aren't very helpful, and often the director makes a decision that quite a lot of what is said in the Greek and now in a quite literal translation has got to go. It might have to go partly because they have decided quite ambitiously they want a singing dancing chorus, and sometimes to get a singing dancing chorus with the singing getting your mouth round quite complicated words is not easy when you're supposed to move as well. I'm sure some of you have experienced yourselves, and so it's really, really complicated. But I suppose today we're in a much better place to begin to understand what you might need to be thinking about. I think most people have someone who is a musician around, or who suggest some music. There's usually someone who's taking responsibility for the movement or the choreography, however ambitious you want to be. I don't think anyone likes something that sounds like uniform declamatory voices. Some of the most effective choruses now know that you can make chorality, as Giovanna was saying, but not necessarily with all the voices together, but you kind of meld voices and you do exciting things with them. And so I think that huge numbers of possibilities, but I'm well aware that all of those are real challenges. And, you know, we've all seen courses that haven't quite worked. But I think that always, for me, the most important thing to remember is that sometimes it doesn't quite work, but we can really admire it, because even when not everything is consistently working with a chorus, there are moments when we are uplifted, because, as I think W.B. Yeats said, the chorus provides the emotion of multitude. And so they are there for a reason, I think. And I felt that in that sort of Japanese production years ago. And so when it works, it is amazing. And you really understand why there's a chorus. Whereas years ago, people didn't understand, which is why they just hung around, usually, you know, the corner of the proscenium arch looking uncomfortable. So difficult, very difficult. But the words, again, as we've said right from the beginning, are really so much the starting point, and maybe the jettisoning point. You know, there are things there you just don't want.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I think I've learned from working on choral odes with Estelle dramaturgically, so from a dramaturgical perspective, is that I think what really helps get the chorus translated, or get the choral odes translated, and it's something that we've experienced together when we did a workshop together with you, Zoe, and the whole cast, is to ask who the chorus is. So what is the identity of the chorus? And that really leads I think that for a translator is the leading question. So who do you want the chorus to be? Now in Euripides Electra, that's a really interesting question, because who are they? You know, the country women of Mycenae, who do they represent, and what kind of story are they telling? And the choral odes that we worked on, the first Sazimon, so the Stasman, about the choral ode about the golden fleece, and how that is an example, is a story that is exemplary to for what is happening in the play before and after. We need to think about as sort of dramaturgs of this choral ode, we need to think about who is telling the story and why. Why are they telling this story, and how does it fit the narrative, the overall narrative, and what is the power that they hold over the narrative itself? So I think these are all sort of very interesting leading questions that a translator needs to ask themselves when translating, when approaching a choral ode, and they're very useful.
Yeah, I think we went for quite an individual approach to the chorus, in that we carved out characters within the chorus as sort of community people, and they all have different traits, I guess. And it's interesting how, even taking an original choral ode, it was so flexible, and we were so able to find these moments that really distinguished each character from each other.
Well, I think that we've come to a sort of conclusion. But thank you so much for answering our questions. It's been very interesting.
It's been a great pleasure, and very good luck, and I look forward very much to seeing the production.